Hey guys, welcome to the Way Wednesdays. I'm your host, Doug Hamp. Pleasure to be with you again. We're digging into the Word. Pastor Gary might join us. I hope he does. But if he doesn't, then too bad for him, huh? Hey, we are in Genesis chapter 12. We are starting the journey of Abraham. I love the Word. I mean, it's so good. I never get tired of it. And I never get to the end of this incredible book that God has given us. So we covered Genesis 1 through 11. We got to see the big backdrop of how the world got to be such a mess. It explained a whole lot. Very interesting stuff. It's always fun to dig into the questions of the Nephilim, Nimrod, etc., and the Tower of Babel, and all those things that happened back then. But that's just the background. God wants to have a relationship with us. And that's why he really spends the rest of the entire Bible on this relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their sons. That is the essence of the relationship. That includes all of the things that we look at with the Messiah, that he came for Israel. Of course, Israel itself, the church, the so-called church, that is all in the context of the relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We have to keep that in mind because that's going to help us really understand this book that we are looking at. So I would suggest, without further ado, let's get into the Word. I will be taking your questions, so please go ahead and put those in the chat. Just let me know, guys. I do have a new microphone. I want to make sure it's working. I did test it, but I want to make sure it's working. And guess who's here? Pastor Gary is here. Fantastic. Hey, Gary.
Hey, glad to be here.
Fantastic, man. It's great to
I've
great
got
to see you.
new stuff
You look kind
too.
of spooky. I don't know. That's like
Oh, yeah, well, it's the season, whatever. I'm feeling spooky.
just the lighting makes you, we
Oh,
got
let me fix that real
I'm on,
quick.
I'm doing the light, you're sort of dark,
Hold on
you
just a
know.
second.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, I'm running a little bit late. I forgot to set up all my stuff here.
Oh, that's fine. I'm just going to start reading because we're getting into the Word. So you go ahead and do that. All right, we're going to start a little bit in chapter 11. Shemin gave us a great suggestion that we should start at the end of chapter 11, and I think it's good advice. So we're going to start back here. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. This is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in Ur of the Chaldeans. Then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, and the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and the daughter of Iscah. But Sarai was barren, she had no child. And Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out from the land of Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. All right, so that gives us some context. And then God says to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you. I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel and pitched his tent in Bethel to the west, on the west, and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. All right, I'm going to stop there. See if looks like Gary has it all figured out now. Very cool. Hey,
Yeah.
fantastic, man. Yeah. So we've got some questions already. One person, who do you think Melchizedek was? We will get to Melchizedek, but not quite yet. So it's a great question. But boy, I was reading Shemin's question before, and I think she raises a very interesting question that Abram's father took them before, right? They left from Babel, right? They left from Ur of the Chaldeans. They left the land of Shinar. Man, Shinar was a nasty place. Now, it probably was a really great metropolis. He would have enjoyed it. But we know that there was a lot of wickedness there. Of course, you had the Tower of Babel. That's where that was. In that general vicinity, you had the woman that rides the beast. She comes from there as well. So it was not a very wholesome place by any means. So the question was, did God call perhaps Abram's father, Nahor, to get out of the land? Did God call Abram from Babel or from Ur? Or did the call only come in Haran? Any thoughts about that, Gary?
Well, the text isn't clear. And I think that's one of the intriguing things about this passage is that we get to think about it. We get to consider different possibilities and try to understand the scriptures and what they're telling to us and how they're talking to us, because it's not clear. It seems like on the surface that Terah decided to uproot and move to Canaan. What provoked him to move to Canaan? It seems obvious from Genesis 12 why Abraham would choose to move to Canaan.
Right.
And so that makes us consider, did Abram at this point in his life, did he influence Terah to take up and move? Did the call come? In other words, are maybe these passages are not necessarily in chronological order? And we see other places in Scripture where chronology is not necessarily observed, so that wouldn't be necessarily unheard of. So we don't know. So there's just a number of possibilities. What do you think is the best option here?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm always hesitant to go beyond the text and to really go outside unless I can find some kind of corroborating evidence. Then I'm willing to step out on a branch a little bit, but on a limb. But otherwise, I just want to be very careful. So I think it's a very intriguing question that Shemin put forward. That maybe it was Terah that said, maybe he got the call from God. But since we don't hear that, we can only speculate, right? That's all we can do is speculate at this point. So, we want to be very careful, but he certainly is calling. He did call Terah out. Now, insofar as whether Terah was a maker of idols, that is, as far as I know, that is just part of the Midrash. That's part of kind of this story idea, and it's not supposed to be taken as fact. I think it's interesting. Now, you will also find that in the book of Jasher. For all you Jasher fans out there, I'm not a fan of the book of Jasher. I think the book of Jasher is extremely late, that it is not authentic. I don't think you can support that. I think the evidence is against the book of Jasher. So you do find that same story in the book of Jasher, which makes me think that it's suspect. It's a very interesting story. I won't deny that. Basically, that Abram comes in and says, "I'm not going to worship these false gods anymore." And he's like, "How can you do that, son?" And then what is it? He destroys the idols, they're destroyed overnight. And then he's like, "Well, it was the idols that did that." And his dad's like, "Well, that's ridiculous. They don't do that." And then he's like, "Oh." right? So that's the basic idea. Anyway, I would just want to be cautious into getting beyond too much of what the scripture says if we cannot substantiate it from other kinds of sources. And I don't think that we can. So,
And I see Shemin's comment down here that says it seems that Genesis 12, 3 and 4 seem to pinpoint when and from Abram started. And started this stage. This is a multi-stage move. This is from Ur of the Chaldees to Haran, from Haran into the Promised Land. The call could have provoked them to come out of Ur of the Chaldees, to come into the land. And then they settled, rested, stayed for a while in their sojourn. I mean, again, it is the speculation, which I think it's fascinating. If Terah received the call and stayed in Haran, then shame on Terah for not.
yeah.
And again, I think I just see so many object lessons here. It's like, how many of us receive the call and we only do it halfway?
Right.
Maybe there's an enthusiasm, and then we find ourselves in a comfortable place, and we become complacent, or we think, oh, this is it, or this is for a season. And I really like the kind of the object lessons that we can draw from the action that takes place, not only on Terah's behalf, but also on Abram's behalf, and Sarai. The one other interesting aspect that I would like to bring out is this call of the land that perhaps Terah was responding to, and as we are leading months into our Israel trip in April 4th, come with us. Respond to that call from the land. I can honestly relate to that. I love to go back to Israel. I love to visit there. I feel a palpable sense of a calling to the land that I think others experience as well. If you're feeling that call, then come with us. This is my opportunity for our travel commercial, but do that. You say, I don't know how I'm going to pay for it. You have a tax return coming in early 2021. Who knows what Congress is going to do with another stimulus check. Find a way. One year I traveled with a friend who sold a tractor so that they could finance their trip to the land. But I do think there's a palpable call to the land that comes from God, that draws people there. And again, it's speculation. We don't have anything to base it on. But there are definite senses that act upon you to go to the land of Canaan, to the land of Israel. And when you arrive, I can't tell you how many people I've spoken to that said, I felt home. I felt like spiritually I was home, that I belonged, that I was meant to be here, even for the time during the trip. And so I think that's a very real thing, that we don't necessarily find in the text, but I think is there nonetheless.
Great thing. Hey, let's keep going here. Let's get into the following verses. So it says, Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 25 years old when he departed Haran. So then Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot's brother, son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem. I already read this. Anyway, I'll go to verse 8. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west, and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai his wife, Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen, when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, This is my wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. So it was, when Abram came into Egypt, that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her, and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, She is my sister? I might have taken her as my wife. Now therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Wow. Good stuff there. So Abram is responding to the call of God. He goes beyond what God said to do, apparently. I don't know that he said, don't go to Egypt, but he said, look, I'm giving you the land of Canaan. This is the land I'm giving you. He goes to a land that was clearly not earmarked for him. God never, ever said that Egypt would be part of Abram's inheritance. So there's clearly something there. It's interesting, I find, that as the father of the faith, he doesn't have the faith to believe that God is going to see him through. He's got this very attractive wife, and he's concerned that they're going to kill him. And so he tells a half truth, right? Because she's my sister. She was his half sister, but not a full sister. And so therefore he's using this to sort of squeak by here, telling a half truth. I see Abram is really going through this time of maturing in his faith, right? He's faithful enough to believe what God said. He's faithful enough to get out of his house, right? He does it. It's a huge step to leave the land of your father and to go to a completely different country where there are giants in the land. We're going to see that really soon. But then he doesn't have the faith to stay there and believe that God is going to protect him. And I take that as really encouragement that God works with us, that Abram did not come fully mature in his faith, but he grew into his faith, so that by the time we get to Isaac and God saying, take your son, your only son, then he does it without hesitation. He completely believes, and he's willing to do it just because God said to do it.
I think that's a really interesting observation, Doug, and starting with with Abraham's response to God's call to separate from his family, to separate from his land, his heritage, his people, and to step out and respond in faith to God's call. That takes a lot, and as believers, oftentimes we see that when we go contrary to the faith tradition that we've been brought up in, if any. To step away. Sometimes division comes in a family, sometimes between spouses, parents. I know in my own instance, I don't follow the same path of faith that my parents did, and certainly not my siblings. And this comes back, to something I have to deal with every time we intersect. I'm getting ready to go see my dad, who's just recently turned 90 years old. He's not doing very well, unfortunately. Pray for him. I'm going back to see him this next, not this weekend, but weekend after. And every time I go there, I kind of prepare myself for, okay, well, I'm going to be confronted for my faith, and I kind of pray myself up and bolster myself up. It's so interesting because if I can take a minor digression, they live in an assisted care facility, and until recently, they have three clergy that are sort of spiritual folks that take care of the campus, and until recently, one of them was a rabbi, Rabbi Jesse. They loved Rabbi Jesse. I never got along better spiritually with my parents than when Rabbi Jesse was there. And he moved off to a congregation. He's in Georgia now. They still communicate with him. They still love Rabbi Jesse. And they can relate more now to the path that I have taken in walking out Torah and understanding why I follow the way of life that I do. And they can appreciate that more. But there's a price oftentimes that is paid in stepping out in that faith. Now, we see kind of this Abram travel log, right? He goes to Bethel and Shechem and Ai and all these places. And then we see that there's a famine in the land. And it's not unusual for us to be confronted with a challenge when we do step out and say, but God, you said, I inherit this place, this land. I'm going to put you in a land. I'm going to make you prosperous. I'm going to give you a people. So to me, it's not a surprise that Abram's thinking, well, now I've got to go down to Egypt. I've got to protect myself. They're going to look at my wife. They're going to get rid of me. It's like, it's not turning out the way that I thought it would. I don't, Sarah still hasn't borne me children. It's like the plan's not working out. And that's not unusual, again, in our faith walk It's like you step out, you think you're really bold, you're on fire, you're ready to go. You're well equipped, and then boom, you get hit with a brick wall. You get one disappointment after another. It's like, okay, I'm all over these places, really trying to find a place to call home, but and start planting my seeds and going down, and it's just not happening. And now there's a famine, and so to get food, I got to go down to Egypt. It's like, what's going on here? So this is kind of what you sign up for. Maybe it doesn't work out that way for everybody. I pray not. But
I think part of faith is having grit. I think the word grit is a great word to describe faith, right? Because we want to have faith that manna is just going to drop out of heaven every day, and that's usually not how it works. Usually, the way God does it is He's like, "Look, I'm going to do this. Now you need to go and be faithful. And as you're faithfully walking in the way, you're going to see these incredible things happen. But only as you're going through the thick of it. And that's where you have to have grit. That's where you have to really have that stick-to-itiveness, perseverance, whatever word you want to use. But you have to get into the grind and then stick with the grind. And we see this happening in the life of Abram, that he's like, okay, I'll do what you said, Yehovah, I'll do that. And it's not happening nearly as fast. And of course, we have the bullet points of his life. I mean, we have maybe 12 chapters, I think, that are dedicated to Abram. That's for, a long lifetime. And we're just getting a few snippets. There are these long spans when God says nothing to him. And it's in those long years you start thinking, did I really hear him say that? Am I just crazy? Have I taken my family on a wild goose chase? Am I nuts for doing this? And that is when you're tested, when you're in that season and that place of doubt, right? You're just in that desert of doubt. And that's a hard place to be because your mind starts playing tricks on you. So, this is not an easy walk by any means. Well, hey, we're in chapter 13. Let's keep moving. Maybe we'll get to chapter 17. Who knows? Then Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him to the south. Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he went on his journey from the south as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there at first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. I just want to say something really quick. There is a school of thought that suggests that the name Yehovah did not come till much, much later. I think that's complete nonsense. We see it as early as the creation. We see what is going on with the name of Yud-He Vav-He. So it's always in there. Unfortunately, there's a school of thought called the Wellhausen School of Thought, Wellhausen theory. It's the Wellhausen documentary hypothesis, it's called. And it's this idea that, well, you have these different sources. You've got J, D, E, and P. So J is the Yahwistic source, then E is the Elohistic source, D is the Deuteronomistic source, and then P is the priestly source. And people are so smart, these scholars are so smart that they've isolated, well, this is really from a different source. This is a guy that really liked the name Yehovah, and so he kept sprinkling it throughout the text. I think it's kind of silly. And I just want to point out that we have this. He made an altar to Yehovah. He knew him by his name. He also knew him by another name, of course, which was El Shaddai. So God has, shall I say, titles. He has one name, so far as I can tell, but he has many titles that we see in Scripture. So he builds an altar and he calls on the name of Yehovah. Lot also, who went with Abraham, had flocks and herds and tents. Now the land was not able to support them, that they might dwell together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. The Canaanites and the Perizzites then dwelt in the land. So Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you take the left, then I will go to the right. If you take the right, then I'll go to the left. And Lot lifted his eyes and saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go towards Zoar. Then Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated from each other. Abram dwelt in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelt in the cities of the plain and pitched his tent even as far as Sodom. But the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked and sinful against the Lord. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land which you see I will give you and your descendants forever. And I'll make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Moreh, which are in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. So again, he built an altar to Yud-He Vav-He, not just merely to God. So we this is our first glimpse of Sodom. You know, if you've been to Israel, you'll know that the area of Sodom and Gomorrah is in the general area of the Dead Sea, and it is awfully hot and dry and dusty and desolate, and it's not a great place to be. It's good if you like to float in the Dead Sea, but otherwise, it's not a place that you're going to like, I'm going to go to that place because it's really rich. So it radically changed. And it's really astounding when you go and you see it today and you're like, this used to be the garden of the Lord? Really? That's crazy to think about how green it must have been. And, you know, part of it, when we go to Israel, we're seeing how it is today, of course. But when we start thinking back on the history and how much the topography has changed, I can hardly wait to see it in the age to come when it is just vibrant when there's just green everywhere, but it's not too humid, right? There's not too many flies, there's not too many mosquitoes. That's going to be great. And God is going to heal the land. It's going to be absolutely gorgeous. But a lot of things have changed, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of observations that pop out to me here. Is one that God could have, well, first of all, Lot and Abraham's grace and character in allowing Lot to choose. I think that as you spoke about Abram gaining maturity through his walk with God, I'd like the way you characterize it so often to me. It's like these are character building moments, and those are often difficult times. But character is something that is so important in your life. That as you walk in a good character, as you take on a good character, you do things that are godlike in terms of being compassionate, being understanding, being loving towards your fellow man, making yourself second and making the other first. And that's what we see with Abram and Lot here. It's like Abram said, have your pick of the litter, take your choice of the land, go where you like. And Lot saw, this Jordan Valley was absolutely lush and beautiful. And he said, "Hey, this is the choicest part of the land. I'll take that." And Abram was fine with it. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't. He didn't say, "Oh, yeah, let me have another choice at this," or maybe you can stay there 6 months and I can stay there. No, that wasn't in his character, and character is so important. The second thing that I want to point out is towards the end of the chapter, God says, "Arise and walk." What has he been doing? He's been all over the land. God says, "Look to the north, south, east, and west. All of these are yours." Is it beyond God just to make it his? No, absolutely not. Yep. He's the creator. He can do anything. But sometimes he just wants us to walk it out.
Yep.
He wants us to put in the miles. He wants us to toil. He wants us to earn it, maybe.
Because then we appreciate it, right? We don't appreciate things that are,
right.
I mean, I think that's, anytime a person becomes a millionaire or a billionaire, they just give it all to their children. I shouldn't say anytime, but sometimes this happens, that the children that grew up with the silver spoon in their mouth have no real appreciation for the toil that it took to earn that money or to build that empire, right? They're just like, well, of course, everybody serves me, right? But the man that built it, or woman, but the person that built it understands, right? And they have a different demeanor because they had to work hard to build that fortune. And then it's hard to see people waste it.
Absolutely. We are promised an inheritance, but we are not trust fund babies. It's like God he gives us all his riches, but we walk it out. We appreciate it. We desire it. We live it. And that's part of the call of doing that. It's not just, he could just easily say, "Oh, here it is, and it's all yours," and it is, it's all ours. But walk here.
Yeah, and when Abram was not demanding his own way, but he let Lot choose, and Lot took the really fancy, lush place. Who made the better choice ultimately, right? Abram did, because we know what happened to Sodom, right? It was a bad place, and God overthrew it. And then Lot had to get out of town, loses his wife, she turns to salt. Then you have the whole weird incest thing, and but they thought it was the end of the world, right? They're like, we're the only 3 people left on the planet, right? I mean, if you really believed that, if you thought you were the only 3 people on the entire planet, you can at least have an appreciation for Lot's daughters, why they did what they did. because they're like, this is it. We're on Mars. There's 3 of us. Unfortunately, one of them is dad, but we still got to keep the human race going. And so they did what they thought was expedient. It was wrong, but it was still what they did. They did what they thought was expedient. So sometimes just waiting, not demanding your own way, it really works out better, because the Lord will then direct you in ways that you could not have seen if you rushed into things. And yeah, that comes with building character and experience, unfortunately. So, man, chapter 14. Okay. And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, and Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that they made war with Bera, the king of Sodom, Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinav, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked the Rephaim in Ashterot, Karnaim, the Zuzim, and Ham, the Emim, and Shaveh Kiriataim, and the Horites in their mountain of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who dwelt in Hazezon Tamar, and the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zebulun, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and joined together in battle in the valley of Siddim. Against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of nations, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, the brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. Now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. The blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him 1/10 of all. Now the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to Yehovah, God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from a thread to a sandal strap, and that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich, except only what the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. Oh, man, that's some great stuff in there, Gary. I'll tell you what, that's pretty exciting stuff. So you got this world war that just happened, right? I mean, this is a world war on a mini scale, right? It's not quite as big as World War I and II, but still, right? It's 5 nations against 4. Notice that one of them is
a big one.
Shinar,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, Shinar, of course, is Sumer. Sumer is the ancient area of Mesopotamia between the 2 rivers. That's literally what Shinar means, is between the 2 rivers. So it's the exact translation of Mesopotamia, right? And so they're coming over. Now, you have to keep in mind that assuming the geography is still, or the topography is still somewhat similar, that you have this big desert area in the middle there. So they had to go around the Fertile Crescent, right? So they would come So you have basically, so Mesopotamia is over here, and you've got Israel, Canaan over here. In the middle here is this big desert area. It's pretty hard to cross. That's possible, but you need lots of water. So usually they'd go up around, that's called the Fertile Crescent, because there was obviously the Tigris and Euphrates rivers there, and it was just fertile. And so that was the way that they would take. We noticed that Abram chased them as far as Dan, so he went up north because they were going back up north to go back home, back to the area of Sumer, or the area of Shinar. So this is a pretty huge undertaking. And we notice also that Abram had a bunch of trained guys in his house that, he's got a huge regiment. These are just the men who are able to fight, right? So it's not just Abram, him and Sarah living by themselves. They have a small village that are living with them, that are working for them. They're servants. They're not slaves in the sense that we've had here, African slavery, which was absolutely terrible. But they're servants, right? This is a pretty good living. They're, I guess, to some degree they belong to Abram. But hey, he's a pretty good employer, and life isn't too bad with him. Now, there's so many things in the text, Gary, that I just don't even know where to start with all this stuff. But I'll just point out a couple things here. Amraphel, some people think this could be Hammurabi. I'm not sure. I think it's interesting to think about that maybe it's Hammurabi. Hammurabi was around 2000 BC, so the time frame would fit. If you start looking at the root letters, so Hammurabi, so you have the A, you got the Hamu, right? Then the R, and then B. So P's and F's are the same exact thing. So it's possible. I think that's a real possibility. I'm not saying that is the case, but I think it could be the case. And I don't know who this Tidal, king of nations, but he's the king of ethnicities, right? Of king of nations, of Goyim, whatever that means. I'm not sure. All right. And then we have all these kings in the area of the Dead Sea. But remember, back then it was just lush. So you have these 5 kings that are living there that are, of course, reigning over their different places. Bera, king of Sodom, Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinav, king of Admah, right? Zeboim and Zoar, right? So these are the 5 cities of the plain that all got destroyed. So when we talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, we're talking about these 5 cities of the plain. Sodom and Gomorrah is just a shorthand for all of these different cities. Notice also, though, says that these kings came and they attacked the Rephaim. Now, that's very interesting, right? The Rephaim, I've been doing a bunch of research on this. Rephaim, it comes from the word Rapha, which means to heal. I suggest, this is my theory, you can take it or leave it, but I believe that they were being healed. Why were they being healed? Because they were becoming Nephilim. What does that mean? They were becoming hybrids, right? They were becoming giants, hybrids. And so they were no longer going to live a normal man's life, but they were becoming part angel and, of course, part man as well. And so they changed. We're going to see that a whole lot more when we get to Deuteronomy. Also, the book of Numbers talks about it. But understand that the Rephaim, the Nephilim, Zamzumim, all these different names that we find, right? The Zuzim, that's probably the same exact thing. The Amim, we find that in Deuteronomy as well, that these are also known as Rephaim. And Rephaim are all known as these hybrids. And Amorites just becomes a general term for all these hybrids. Now, I would suggest that when we get to chapter 15, God's going to say that the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And what I believe is happening, and I just wrote this in my book, that the Amorites were in a process of being transformed. They were choosing to become hybrids, right? They weren't born that way, but they were taking on, just as Nimrod became a Gibor, as he became a Nephilim. In the Greek, it says that he became a Giga, which is a giant. He became a hybrid, that the Amorites are taking this on, right? So right now they're in the process of becoming this hybrid race. And God's going to say to Abram that, they're going to have 400 years. And then in the fourth generation, he's going to take Abram's descendants out of Egypt, and they're going to come in, and that's a whole a different part of the story, of course. But
So, Doug, if I could,
Yeah,
interrupt that,
please.
because this is fascinating. This would suggest that they have some contact with the angelic realm. The
Well,
fallen
here's
angelic
something
realm.
interesting, Gary, is that the name of their god is Amuru in Akkadian. In Sumerian, it's Martu. Martu, that's really interesting, right? Martu, same letters as Nimrod, same letters as Ninurta, which is Lord of the Earth. So Ninurta is called the son of Enlil. Enlil is Satan, right? So all roads lead us back to Satan. We actually find that they have the same pictogram or same logogram in Sumerian, which is the same as Satan. And which is interesting that it just happens to be the word Bad, B-A-D, bad, right? And it's kind of ironic.
How convenient.
Yes, he is. Okay. So I think that Nimrod, who became this son of Satan, who became a Gibor, a hybrid, I think that he was making it possible for them to have this option to become gods, to become hybrids.
So would you suggest then that the veil between the spiritual world was very thin in those days, or there was more intersection that occurred, or these hybrid people just existed on Earth and interacted with man more frequently than, or maybe not more frequently than we see today?
Well, I think something happened at Babel. Babel means so it's Babu Ilu, which is gate of the gods. So I think that Babel was not just trying to build a skyscraper, but they were trying to build a Stargate, trying to build a portal. And that's why God came and messed the whole thing up. He wasn't like, hey, they're building a skyscraper. Do you see that? We got to stop this skyscraper. This isn't going to work. God wasn't against skyscrapers. He wasn't against tall buildings. He was against that particular building because that was intended to be a Stargate so that Satan could open the gates of Hades and invade the world. And but before that, he raises up Nimrod. Nimrod is very interesting because he does not start as a hybrid. He becomes a hybrid. Now, we're not told exactly how he does that, but Satan, very intelligent, I believe he has a technology or some kind of cultic or occultic means to make this happen. As I've shared before, this guy named Chris out of Reno, Nevada, had a bone marrow transplant. And 3 months after getting his bone marrow transplant from this guy in Germany, they check his sperm, and it turns out his sperm is not his own anymore. It belongs to his donor, right? So if Chris from Reno, Nevada sires children, he's going to be having kids for his donor, not his own kids, right? So we see that it is possible to change our genetics. Even epigenetically, maybe something happened. And it could be that somehow there's also something known as the sacred marriage, where a priestess of the goddess Inanna would have relations with the king, and that would somehow install him as king. That would make him the son of Enlil. So there's different possibilities. I don't know which one of those Satan did, because I don't want to dabble that deep into it. But
it seems regardless, though, that after Babel occurs, you have this dispersed population with a set of intellectual property that now goes out to these different nations that knows something about this Stargate, this ability to communicate or intersect with demonic realms.
Right. Yeah, and it's
Crazy.
interesting that they go as far as Seir. Seir, we're getting up toward the land of Bashan, right? So that's up toward the land of Mount Hermon, which is where the angels came down in the days of Noah. So
Yeah.
the whole land, I think it's kind of like Little Red Riding Hood, where you have, once the big bad wolf discovers where she's going, then he goes ahead and sets up a trap. And I think that's what Satan was trying to do, is he was trying to set up a trap. He figures, oh, God has now called Abram to this place, so I'm going to go and infest it. I'm going to go and literally infest it, right? So it starts slowly, but by the time the children of Israel come, the land is overrun with these Nephilim. And they're just generally called Amorites. And so then they become this wicked nation. But just being an Amorite did not necessarily mean that you were a Nephilim, but it meant that you and your people were making that choice to become a Nephilim. And I believe that is the iniquity of the Amorites that God talks about.
Very, very interesting topic. And so I think characterizing this as a world war that was going on in this region. It's with all of the actors involved here. There's just a lot happening.
Yeah, and Abram, he goes out and he fights and he wins, and it's God was with him. God took care of him. We don't know how much he was like, okay, I know God's going to take care of me, or he just went, and then he was like, wow, God took care of me. We don't know, but again, that's kind of looking at our faith from the hindsight position. When you're going into it, you never know, right? There's no sense of how it's going to absolutely turn out. You just have to walk in faith and say, you know what? God told me that he's going to protect me. He said that I'm going to have a son, right? So if he doesn't have a son at this point, he's probably thinking, I'm almost invincible because God said that he was going to bless me. He's going to do all these things. So I do not need to fear, and that he's going to bless those who bless me and curse those who curse me. So, maybe Abram is really walking in faith at this point. But again, we're seeing his development in his faith. So then he becomes the father of the faith. He becomes this champion of the faithful, but he doesn't start that way, right? It's a walk, it's a journey. And I think that's so important that all of us remember that we're on a spiritual walk. That as we grow in the Lord, hopefully our faith is being strengthened, because we are going through those tough times. We are going through the times of character building, and there is no shortcut. We all would like a shortcut, but there is no shortcut. You have to go out and face your giants, and then when you come home and you're like, I just whooped a bunch of giants, you're like, you know what? That was because God was with you. And the only way you can have that faith is by going out and fighting the giants and experiencing that fear and say, oh no, what's going to happen? But then you say, wait, God's with me. He will not leave me. He will not forsake me. And then you go. And then the next time, it's a bit easier. Of course, the challenge gets bigger, right? So God is always taking us to that next level so that we can grow and we can get even stronger. But that's a good thing, right? Because we want to be stronger. We don't want to be weak and stay where we were, but we want to grow in this.
Yeah,
now let's get to Melchizedek.
This is go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
I know we need to move on, and we could spend a lot of time.
Somebody asked, who do you think Melchizedek is? So I'm just going to give my perspective. I'm not sure where you stand on this, Gary, and I know others may have different perspectives. I am not persuaded that Melchizedek was Jesus. Now, there is a whole thing in the book of Hebrews where it talks about Melchizedek, who did not have any, didn't have a genealogy, right? No father or mother. And so people have come to the conclusion that maybe this is Jesus. I am not persuaded that. So Melchizedek means the king of righteousness. He lived in the area of Jerusalem at the time, right? He's the king of Salem, which is Jerusalem. I think that God had a lot of people that were worshiping him. Abram was not the only one, right? We know that Abram's father-in-law was a worshiper of the Most High God. So this was not unheard of. I wouldn't say it was common, but it was not unheard of. And what I would suggest that Melchizedek, we just don't know where he came from. In my opinion, that does not make him Jesus. I think if he were to be Jesus, it would be kind of this weird time warp type thing, because Jesus came, he came in the, what's the word I'm looking for? He's of the office of Melchizedek, right? He's not Melchizedek, but he came in the order of Melchizedek. In other words, Melchizedek was not of the order of Levi. He was of his own order. And so Jesus is coming in this other order. He is a real, authentic, authorized priest, if you will, but he's not one of the Aaronic or Levitical order. He's of a different order. But to say that he is Melchizedek would say that Jesus came in his own order, which I think kind of throws up some weird, some weird things. So that's my perspective. What do you think, Gary?
I agree. I think Melchizedek was a historical character that has a lot of mystery around him, and in that we don't see a genealogy, we don't see where he comes from. He just kind of appears. He definitely carries some name recognition with him. People say, "Oh, wow! Oh, so you're Melchizedek. You're the priest of the Most High God." So he's clearly recognized as some a cut above the rest. Is a way of putting it. But I agree. I think he's his own historical character that Yeshua is. I agree with you on the order of because Yeshua was not of the priestly line, right? He was of the tribe of Judah.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to take a little time to get to some of these questions. I'm hard pressed because I want to get to more of the text, but I want to get to the questions as well. Let's get through a couple of these questions. So we answered Michael's question, who was Melchizedek? So we kind of got to that one. And let's see, this is from Ed. He asked the question, I find it interesting that Yehovah used Abram's people of origin to destroy the temple. Any significance to this? I think yes. I think God loves to deal with recycle things, right? So he's going to take something, right? Abram's coming from Ur. He's coming from the land of Babel. He's coming from the land of Shinar, where Nimrod set up his evil kingdom. And so then he's going to use those same people hundreds of years later, of course, to destroy the temple. Satan is going to think, man, I've got God over the barrel, right? And God's like, no, you don't, right? So, there's this mind game that's going on between God and Satan throughout the scriptures. And I think, I'm speculating here, but I think God kind of lets Satan think that he's winning, and that's when he pulls a fast one. God pulls a fast one. And he's like, gotcha. So it's kind of subtle things in there, but that's the sense that I get. Another question from Michael: did Abram learn from Noah? Well, great question, Michael. We don't have any direct evidence. I think it's possible because Noah was living until just the beginning of Abram's life, but we don't have any evidence that they were connected somehow, that they knew of one another. Just because it's like, if you live in a certain town and I say, oh, do you know Joe? And you're like, well, there are, 50,000 people in this city. So no, I don't know everybody, right? So just because they were around at the same time doesn't mean that they knew each other. But then again, doesn't mean that they didn't, right? And maybe they did, but I think all we can do at this point is really speculate. I don't know that we can have a definitive.
I think the more interesting question there is, did Melchizedek learn from Noah? How did he become a priest of the Most High God? How did he know about the Most High God? And so you talk about these others that knew of Yehovah. Did they learn from Noah? Likely. I could make an argument for that.
I think that's a great point, Gary. It's a very good point. This is from James Boyd. Don't you think we have many Canaanite altars in America, Brother Doug? Well, I suppose it depends what we mean by altar. We probably don't have the kind of altars that they had in the ancient day, but are we sacrificing our lives to ancient gods? Oh yeah, big time, big time. I think there's some obvious ones. People have talked about some of the architecture in Washington D.C., and I think you can make an incredible case that a lot of the architecture in Washington D.C. is Masonic and it's evil. But rather than just throwing stones at them, I think we need to say, am I making altars in my life? Am I worshiping things? Am I laying things on that altar and sacrificing things to these would-be gods? And I think that's the more dangerous thing instead of merely the architecture in Washington, D.C. and other places. But it is still there. And I think some of it is kind of a little bit creepy. So
I think the believer's response to that is, what did Abram do over and over again? He'd go to these places. He would build an altar in Canaan, and he would proclaim the name of God.
Yeah.
That is our opportunity. That when we see darkness on the horizon, it's like we have the opportunity, as we're sojourners in this land, to proclaim the name of God and to be His light and to shine for Him in that darkness that seems to be all around us. But I tell you, the light always wins.
Amen. No, that's a good word. Jay Jones says a major power and financial shift is happening in the Mideast right now that shakes up the balance. How does the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, 15, 17, 18, 22 correlate with today's Abrahamic Accords? Well, I don't know. I'm going to wait and see. Sometimes we have a lot of fanfare about some of these things. I believe that we need to let some time pass to then really see what's going to happen. It could just be that it's a nice name, but it falls apart. It could be that it's something lasting. And I just don't think that we have enough data at this point to start drawing definitive conclusions. It's my opinion. Any thoughts, Gary?
We just finished the book of Revelation. And for those of you who didn't have an opportunity to view Doug's teachings, go on a YouTube channel, Book of Revelation from it in its entirety. And what I see is that all nations will rise up against Israel at the end of time. And so I'm grateful that anytime Israel can get a moment of peace and security, but at the end of the day, it's not going to last. We know what the end of the book is, and it has to come about so that God will prevail. So while I really like what's happening in terms of friendships with and alliances now with Islamic governments and nations. I think only good things can come from that. That's not the end of the book, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Well said. So Tali has a question. She says, where can we read and are we to believe that Abram did go through the born of the Spirit, or if he believed the idea as described in John 3:3-5. Well, so I've got the text here. So let's just take a look. Most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. And he says in verse 5, most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. So I'm going to try to answer a somewhat complicated theological question pretty quickly. But understand that when God made Adam, he breathed the Holy Spirit into Adam. When Adam sinned, he lost the Holy Spirit. All right. So Man had been without the Holy Spirit for some 4,000 years, from Abram till Jesus breathed it into the disciples. But there was another experience, which is called the epi. That's the Greek word upon. And that when the Holy Spirit would come upon somebody, he came upon Jephthah, came upon Gideon, came upon David, came upon Saul, as a matter of fact. And they did great exploits when the Holy Spirit came upon them. So to be born of the Spirit means that, first of all, you're walking according to God's commandments. You're walking according to his ways. Clearly, we see that Abram was walking according to God's ways. We see that in Genesis chapter 26, verse 5. God is kind of bragging to Isaac about his dad. He says that Abram kept my ways, my statutes, my ordinances, and my Torah. So he was doing that. He was a man that walked with God. Now, was he quote unquote born again? Well, I would suggest that he probably was not in a technical sense, because Jesus had not breathed the Holy Spirit, because he had not been crucified and resurrected. So he was not able to then give man that infilling of the Holy Spirit. And that could only happen after Jesus died and resurrected. So Abram died in faith that he would be resurrected, that he would meet the Messiah. And so he was born again in a sense of he was looking forward to the born again experience, though he himself did not experience the born again experience, but he died believing that it was coming, believing that the Messiah would come and would right all things. So he's definitely going to be born again when he's resurrected. But in a technical sense, I would say no, he was not, even though his heart was clearly for the Lord. All right. Here's one good one from Ruth. What is faith? Nice, short, but difficult question. But we probably can answer that. Faith is believing God and then walking accordingly, right? That you're trusting that what he said he's going to do, he'll do. And because you're trusting in it, it means that your actions are going to mirror your statement of faith, right? When you say, oh, I believe that you're going to do that. Faith is really quite simple, actually. We have faith every time we get on an elevator. We have faith that the Otis elevator company, built it to specs, and that they've taken care of it, they've maintained it, so that when I step on that thing and hit the button, I'm not going to fall to my death. I have faith that they are doing what they say they're going to do. I have so much faith, I don't even think about it, right? I just do it. I have faith when I put my foot on the brakes that my car is going to stop, because I have faith in the manufacturer of the brakes and the car company that all those parts are going to work together, and I'm not going to, go crashing into the wall. So we have faith in a lot of different areas. It's just believing in what God has said. At least in a religious context, it's believing what God has said. But we exercise faith every day of our lives in very, mundane kind of ways. Gary, any?
Yeah, I would just add that there's a couple of characteristics of faith that I think are difficult to carry out, because there's this unwavering aspect of faith, that in the face of trial, does your faith remain? We talked about Abraham, when the famine hit, when the World War went on, all of these types of things. As your character builds, as you mature in your walk, as you see God being demonstrated in your life over and over again, it should strengthen your faith. I think the other aspect of faith is a tendency for us to become complacent. That when things are going good, our faith isn't exercised. We think, oh, we're doing good. I did a good job. I got a raise. Things are going fine. Nothing. I don't have any hardships. And so we kind of put those wins on ourself and say, oh, I did that win, as opposed to, God was able to do those things for me. So there's things that test our faith. And complacency and I think unwaveringness are two aspects that hit us kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum, of the faith spectrum. Um, but other than that, I agree with you completely, Doug. Well said.
Yeah. Cool. There's a little comment. People are asking about whether there was a vav in ancient Hebrew, suggesting maybe it was pronounced as a W. That's a little bit of a complicated phonetic and linguistic discussion. Part of the confusion is that a lot of our literature, a lot of the scholarship that has been done on the Hebrew language was done by Germans, and Germans, their letter W is actually a V, right? So when they wrote something with a W, then it was actually being pronounced as a V, right? So that's just one thing to keep in mind, right? Think about the Volkswagen, right? So you have the Volkswagen, right? And for us, it's a W, but it was definitely a V. When we do comparative linguistics, we see that there was a V in the Hebrew language. When we go to things like Arabic, then there is no V, but it's actually either a B or it's a W. So, there's still some debate as to what exactly it was. I'm fairly well convinced that there was a V, all the way back. But, there's definitely discussion about that. But as we come more into the first century, we see, by looking at, again, comparative linguistics, we look at Hebrew words that are transliterated into things like Greek, and we see that very often it's translated as a veta. The letter beta was actually a veta with a V sound. And so that gives us a pretty good sense that it was being pronounced as a V and not as a W, not a W. So very cool. Man, there's so many questions. We're not going to get to them all. This is such a bummer. But we can take a few more. Let's see here. Just want to get to some more of these questions. Let's see. All right. Here's a question. I thought the Nephilim were born that way via angels and humans mating. So this is from Snow Beach. You're absolutely right, but that was before the flood. Before the flood. After the flood, it was a different process. This is all brand new stuff. It's in my new book. So it's coming. I'm writing it as fast as I can. I want you to know. But my fingers won't go any faster, and my brain gets tired after a while, and I got to take a break. But it's coming, so just hang in there. Let's see, another question. Trying to get some of your questions here, guys. Maybe we'll get through some of them. A lot of discussion, which is great. And let's see. There's a lot here. Very cool. Well, guys, if you put a Q before your questions, it really helps me just to spot them quickly so that I know that you're asking a question and not just commenting. So, well, I guess that's all I can see. So we'll have to stop there. Gary, I just want to really quickly summarize chapter 15. So chapter 15 is a very significant passage because that is where, after this incredible battle, Abram's a little bit shaken up, right? And God comes to him and says, don't be afraid. I'm your strong shield, your strong reward. And then he says, hey, God, I don't have any kids, right? And Eliezer ben Damascus, Eliezer, son of Damascus, is going to be my heir. What should I do about that? And God says, no, just look up. See all those stars? That's going to be your descendants. And Abram believed, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Very significant. Paul makes that same point in the book of Romans when he's talking about circumcision. He says, look, was he declared righteous before circumcision or after? Before. And I agree with Paul. He was clearly declared righteous before he was circumcised. And then in chapter 17, he's going to be circumcised and his whole household for the land. It's a land covenant. It's a land promise. It's a sign of the land. So people that are circumcised are demonstrating their inclusion in that land agreement. Brother Gary?
No, I totally. It's just a shame we can't spend more time
I know.
in these passages because they're so critical. And I think that was just one instance where God's Abraham believed and God awarded to him his righteousness. Just as we started out in Genesis 12, he responded in a call to come over, to come into the land, to believe that he would have these offspring. And again, we see the human side of Abram too, and Sarai, where it says, okay, well, we know God gave us these promises, but we don't see it happening. So let's do the thing with Hagar.
Yeah. So true.
I just love these passages because they teach us so much about what it means to walk in our faith, and
Yep.
and know that we do this as flawed human beings,
Right.
and how we build our character over time to the point where in our next portion we'll be reading about the sacrifice of Isaac, the Akedah.
Yeah. Yep. And it's really cool. God is so patient, and he is amazing that he can stitch our mess ups into the story. You think about the Bible, it's not like it just fell out of the sky, but it was made by people as they lived it, and then they recorded their story, and then that became the Holy Writ, right? And we see God's fingerprints all over this thing. But it's this story of redemption. It's the story of choosing Abram and then leading him, right? So every person is just a little microcosm. They're part of the macrocosm, but all of these stories fit together. It's like when you see those pictures and then you zoom in and then you see little tiny faces, right? And then you zoom out, you see one big gigantic face, right? That's the idea we have here, is that when we zoom in, we just see Abram and his face. We see his story. Then we zoom out and we see this big giant story, this big giant face called God's people, his beloved, his bride. But then you zoom back in, you see David. You zoom out, and you see how God is faithful. You zoom back in, you see Moses. You see all these different figures of the faith that had their own struggles, their own failures, their own fears. And yet God allowed them to live their lives, the good stuff, the bad stuff, and then he wove it all into this phenomenal story.
Yeah.
And guess what? We're part of that too, right? So
that's right. And we're a pivotal part. We are
Yes.
an important part.
Yes.
We're not just passengers along on this train. We have a role, and the more we understand that, the more we believe that, the more we walk in that as if we have a purpose, because people, we do.
Yep. Well said. Well, guys, it's been another great Midrash with you. Thank you for tuning in. Please join us on Shabbat. We're going to be finishing up the book of James. If you're in Denver, come and check us out. We are in Lakewood, Colorado. God bless you. See you next week.
Join us in Israel.